Roquan Smith formally requested a trade as his hold-in continues. Negotiations breaking down with the Chicago Bears. We'll get you caught up on everything that's happened and figure out what could his trade value be and how likely is it that he even stays with the Chicago Bears.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, hopefully every day. On the show today, we got to figure out what's going on with Roquan Smith. We'll go through the statement Roquan Smith sent to Ian Rapoport and figure out why he's upset. We'll hear from General Manager Ryan Poles and get his side of the story and kind of figure out who's more at fault based on what we know so far and why there's probably a little bit of blame to go around here at all. We'll look at okay, if a trade is in the future, which doesn't look like at this moment, what could a trade for Roquan Smith get? What might that look like? What are the different distinguishing factors going in here, not only for a trade, but also for a contract extension? Maybe why the Bears haven't just ponied up for whatever Roquan Smith would want. And we'll look at some of the other top linebacker contracts that Roquan Smith might also be looking at. So let's start here with how the news broke at the beginning of the day on Tuesday. Via Ian Rapoport, basically Roquan Smith typed out a Notes app note message on his iPhone and texted it to NFL Insider. It's certainly the new way of doing things now in 2022. Roquan Smith's letter started, "To the city of Chicago and all of the Bears fans worldwide, I've officially requested a trade. Just writing these words is deeply painful. I'm a kid from Macon County, Georgia. When you grow up playing football, you dream of making it to the NFL one day. However, playing the linebacker position, you never imagined getting drafted in the top 10 by the Chicago Bears. I'm a homegrown Bear, a dream come true for me to have an opportunity to put that Bears helmet on, wear the same jersey that the legendary linebackers did. It's an indescribable feeling. Walking these hallways the past 4 years, you can feel the spirit, you feel the pressure to live up to the timeless history, that great legacy. I dreamed of playing like Wilbur Marshall, Singletary, Briggs, Urlacher, Butkus. Since the day I was drafted, I vowed to play the position at a level that upheld the standard that was set before me, to uphold that respect and honor that I have. Unfortunately, the new front office regime doesn't value me here. They've refused to negotiate in good faith. Every step of this journey has been, quote, take it or leave it. The deal sent to me is one that would be bad for myself and for the entire linebacker market if I signed it. I've been trying to get something done that's fair since April, but their focus has been on trying to take advantage of me. I wanted to be a Bear for my entire career, help this team bring a Super Bowl back to our city. However, they've left me no choice than to request a trade that allows me to play for an organization that truly values what I bring to the table. I haven't had the chance to talk to the McCaskey family, and maybe they can salvage this, but as of right now, I don't see a path back to the organization I truly love. I hope and pray you all can understand. I'm deeply sorry it's come to this. Sincerely, Roquan Smith." That concludes the segment of Lorin Reads. Normally, I wouldn't take the time to read a whole thing like that, but I think it's really important to make sure that we're getting sort of the full picture there from Roquan Smith, and particularly with him, the thing that stood out to me at the end, not only just texting it to Ian Rapoport and going about it through the media this way, which is a negotiation tactic, certainly, but at the end there, I haven't had the chance to talk to the McCaskey family, and maybe they can salvage this. Interesting way to sort of pull ownership into this, right? And say, well, George, and kind of go to the fan base too and say, hey, the McCaskies aren't in on this yet. Maybe they can fix it, because he's not saying, hey, George, fix this. He's saying, oh, well, maybe the owners could maybe fix it, but I haven't had a chance to talk to them, so I don't know. We'll see. And it definitely puts the organization in a difficult spot to where your ownership, you don't necessarily want them meddling in day-to-day football decision-making, and this is a little bit more day-to-day. It's going to be a multi-year football decision, but we were already not super thrilled with how involved George McCaskey was in the general manager and head coaching search. And even if we're on board with the decisions he did make in that doesn't mean, hey, let's have George McCaskey be involved in more decisions. Let's have him be involved in personnel. I mean, and George himself has said pretty clearly, like, he wants to stay out of personnel. He's going to let the general manage generally and let the head coach and stay out of it from there. So I think, well, it's maybe a valiant effort by Roquan Smith to try and get ownership involved or try and rope them into it a little bit. Everything we've heard from George over the years would seem to indicate that most likely he's probably not going to intervene, especially when you think back to, like, for example, the exit for Brian Urlacher at the end of his career was not graceful by the Bears organization. There have been a lot of those over the years that if George McCaskey was going to step in and meddle to make sure, Lovie Smith's exit went well, or things like people who meant a ton to the history of this organization, then McCaskey would have meddled in those situations and they may have gone better. So I don't think, if he's not going to meddle in the departure of Brian Urlacher, I can't imagine he's going to meddle in Roquan Smith as requesting a trade and a contract extension. He's just not. That doesn't seem like that's likely going to be the case. So then it comes back to, once again, kind of like the Tevin Jenkins situation. It's on Ryan Poles and this front office and this coaching staff, but mostly in this case, the front office, to figure it out, to try and reconcile things that are going on with Roquan Smith right now and how these negotiations have broke down, and maybe adjust their offering and their negotiation tactics and try and get him back in the room and figure out a way to right this ship one way or another for this Bears organization. They seem to be on somewhat of the right path with Tevin Jenkins. It's not a one-to-one comparison here, because we don't know exactly what's going on with Jenkins, but Roquan's is purely a contract situation. And Matt Eberflus has said he and the coaching staff with Roquan only talk football and don't really talk business. So that's all fine there. I don't think there's anything to read into more of this. It has everything to do with purely just what these contract offers are, and him wanting to get the absolute best value for himself and the most money he can and set the linebacker market. And like all those things are, like, of course, any one of us in Roquan Smith's shoes would also want as much money as possible from an organization that could just as clearly move on from you whenever they decide that they don't value you enough. We'll hear Ryan Poles' side of the story and get into some of the positional value, contract, and trade details involved in this next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.net, the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. No odds yet on a Roquan Smith trade or anything just yet, but you can bet on this upcoming Bears season. A line for week 1 against the 49ers, win total over under 6.5, odds to make the playoffs, and so much more. There's tons of different ways you can bet right now today at BetOnline. Not just football, but all of your leagues. You can find news and reviews for Major League Baseball, the season going on right now, plus futures for the NBA, for hockey, for combat sports, tennis, soccer, golf, esports, you name it. BetOnline is the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information. Live in-game betting scores, they've got you covered. Head on over to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening right now. BetOnline, where the game starts. At this point, I'm not willing to bet on whether Roquan Smith will be with the Chicago Bears or not, but General Manager Ryan Poles is staying firm in his positions in a couple different ways. One, he's staying firm that they do want to sign Roquan Smith and don't particularly, well, he didn't use the words, but the implication being then that they don't want to trade him if they can avoid it. But he's also fairly firm in his position that he's going to do what's in the best interest of his team, and that the team is bigger and more important than any one individual player, including Roquan Smith. But here, I'll let the general manager kind of say it in his own words here, and then we'll dive in a little deeper.
All right, so wanted to come in here and, let everyone know, obviously, we're aware of everything that's popped up with Roquan and Twitter. So I thought it would be best just to address it straightforward. I'll double down on what I've said before. My feelings for Roquan haven't changed at all. I think he's a very good football player. I love the kid, love what he's done on the field, which makes me really disappointed where we're at right now. I thought we'd be in a better situation, to be completely honest with you. In terms of our philosophy in the front office, I've always believed and always will be that we take care of our homegrown talent. We pay them, we take care of them, and we take care of them for what they've done and what they can become in the future. And with this situation, we've showed respect from a very early time frame. And with that said, I mean, there's record-setting pieces of this contract that I knew for a fact I thought was going to show him the respect that he deserves, and obviously that hasn't been the case. With that said, we can't lose sight that this isn't about one player. My job is to build a roster that's going to sustain success for a long period of time. And at the end of the day, we got to do, what's best for the Chicago Bears. So I'll take a few questions from you. I just wanted to make sure I got up. I addressed this with you. We know what's going on, and we're doing everything we can to get this done.
Ryan, is your intention to trade him as his request asks for, or do you think something can be worked out here?
Right now, my intentions are to sign Roquan to this team, and we're going to take it day by day. And at the end of the day, we got to do what's best for this organization. But my intentions are to make sure Roquan Smith's on this team.
Were you aware that it was this dire, I guess, in his mind?
It's a little bit, there's always going to be a little bit of separation, but at the same time, for an extension, it's got to make sense for both sides. And obviously we're not at that point for him to put that out there.
You can sense the tone there from Ryan Poles that I don't think the organization was super thrilled that Roquan Smith decided to go about it exactly in this way, right? That all of a sudden it becomes this public sort of media out in the open negotiations as opposed to just keeping things in-house. And even if you're upset, let's keep working through this and not text Ian Rapoport, exactly what's going on and kind of, all of a sudden take the situation outside of the doors of the building. But at the same time, Ryan Poles is coming from the position of power and largely the position of leverage in this situation. And so I don't, it's easy to kind of be on his side in terms of how this dynamic's being played out. But you also kind of feel for Roquan in this sense that Ryan Poles can paint it as there have been historic parts of the deal, but that's not telling the whole picture. So Ian Rapoport was also on 670 The Score on Tuesday afternoon after this. I don't have the audio or certainly there's not video for radio to play for you, but the quote from Ian Rapoport was really interesting. He said, "This has sort of been boiling. The negotiating style of the Bears sounds like something Roquan's extremely frustrated with. Cliff Stein is back in the saddle negotiating the contracts, and it's been difficult. Obviously, some of the rookie deals took a long time. So there's probably a bit of a firmness, and maybe harshness isn't the right word, but certainly maybe a different style of the contract negotiating right now than Roquan Smith was used to with the previous regime. And also, although with the previous regime, he did hold out into training camp for his rookie contract too. So there's a little bit of a history with this. Also, Roquan Smith does not have an agent, so he might not be getting maybe the typical advice that you might expect in these types of situations. Not to say that he's making bad choices, though, either, because he has to maximize his leverage. And one of the things that Rapoport specifically noted is that in what the Bears are offering, they've heavily backloaded the offer so that the last year of the deal has a lot of money in it, but isn't likely that Roquan Smith is going to reach or that they're going to, honor that last year of the deal because it likely wouldn't have very much guaranteed money. So what they do is they put an abnormally big dollar amount in that last year that inflates the average per year. So when you look at it, maybe the contract averages, $20 million a year or whatever it might be. But if a bunch of that money's in the last year and he never gets that money from the last season, then really he's only getting the average from the first few seasons that might be separately lower when you don't count that last season as part of the overall average. So that's how Ryan Poles can come out and say there are historic aspects, record-breaking aspects of the deal, but maybe it still doesn't make it a good deal or a smart deal or a fair deal or a wise deal for Roquan Smith. And like Roquan Smith said, for the rest of the linebacker market, which has also been a little bit inflated in some recent deals that have come out. I mean, Fred Warner signed his contract extension with the San Francisco 49ers. That was 5 years, $95 million, about $19 million per year. And then, of course, the Colts and Shaquille Leonard, the man formerly known as Darius Leonard, now goes by Shaquille Leonard, got 5 years, $98.5 million. So both of them just under $20 million a year. I would imagine that's about the mark that Roquan Smith is going to be looking at in a deal like this. But from the Bears' perspective, you look around the NFL and you can see that some of these types of deals, these big contracts for off-ball linebackers, these sort of true, middle linebackers, outside linebackers that aren't edge rushers, haven't always super well played out well for the teams. Guys in recent years that got big contracts, Jalen Smith, Deion Jones from the Falcons, Miles Jack from the Jaguars, even Anthony Barr from the Vikings, who does some pass rushing. Like, these guys have kind of fallen off soon after getting their big deals to the point where, they just end up looking like bad deals for the team and end up being difficult for the team to get out of. And that's not to say that, Roquan Smith is destined to do that. And clearly, no one's expecting Fred Warner or Shaquille Leonard to drop off in that way, but it's not a position that always carries as much value on the field. We'll get into some of that positional value in this Bears defense, and then what that might look like in a trade value from other teams, and how this all could play out next on Locked On Bears. For those of you watching on the Locked On YouTube channel, my autofocus on my camera here keeps going out, and I do these podcasts live all the way through, and I've been trying to get my focus back in. This will be edited out for the people that listen to the actual podcast, but it's something about the way the lighting is in here right now. I'm trying to move in the right position so the camera will refocus, because it autofocus to out of focus. So all you got to do is get it back into focus, and I can't quite get it there. But back to Roquan Smith. It doesn't seem like the way Ryan Poles talked there that the Bears are eager to trade Roquan Smith, but I also think he's realistic about the situation and knows that the team will eventually have to go on without him if they're not able to work the deal, and that realistically, they'll get by. Doesn't seem like good business practice to, draft and have a 25-year-old linebacker who's very, very good at what he does and ultimately let him out of the organization. But again, I think it can be more complicated than that, because when you're thinking about how you would ideally want to build a team and spread your money around and your assets, this type of linebacker position, you don't want to say it's not valuable, because all 11 players on the field on defense especially are valuable. I mean, I think nose tackle would probably be the least valuable position on the field in terms of how impactful they are down in and down out. But after that, it becomes a little bit splitting hairs here and there. But you think about what's most important for defense, having really good pass rushers on the outside and also on the inside, but pass rushers are really important. And having really good coverage players are quite important. But in coverage, a lot of times it's cornerbacks and safeties that are going to get targeted more often than linebackers, because that's where more often the wide receiver matchups are going to be. And so when you start ranking where the positions are most and least important on defense, that linebacker spot ends up lower on the list. Not that it's not important, but just that other positions tend to be more important. And so it's okay, do you want to invest $20 million on a player who's very good at his position, but maybe that position is not as valuable to your defense as the pass rusher, the cornerback, and the safety. And the problem here is that the Bears are in a position where they just need as many good players as they can. And so they can't just say, ideally we don't want to spend at linebacker, so we'll let him go and try and find another 25-year-old Pro Bowl caliber player. It's too hard to find really good players to just say, screw it, he's replaceable, the position's not that valuable, let's move on from him. When you have a player like Roquan that can and has shown to be truly something special in the NFL, it's not like he's just kind of above average, and those guys are a little bit more replaceable and not as then valuable to try and sign. But it's why Ryan Poles, I believe him when he says, hey, let's try and work this out with Roquan Smith. At the very least, the Bears are in a good spot where they should be able to get pretty good trade value for Roquan Smith. Ian Rapoport has said first-round pick plus if the Bears were to trade Roquan Smith. And that's only, I think, if they just really can't get him back in. But I get the impression from the way Rapoport describes his contract negotiation that the Bears have some room here to come to Roquan Smith with something a little bit better. It feels to me like the way Rapoport described them backloading that last year of the contract, that makes it very team friendly, but it also feels a little bit like taking advantage of it. I think that was the word Roquan Smith used in his situation there. It's like, I've been trying to get something done that's fair since April, but their focus has been on trying to take advantage of me. And I think that's what he's seeing with that last year of the contract. And you don't have to structure the deal that way. And to some extent with Roquan, it's like you either value him as a top linebacker that you want to have around your organization for the long term, and you pay him and you meet him in the middle. Because what's the difference, right? If Roquan says, I need $20 million a year, and you're saying, we're $18 and $19 million. That's about where we want to be. $1 million a year across 5 years on your salary cap and your cash flow, not a big deal. You can absorb that just fine. It was the same argument I was making with Allen Robinson over the last couple of years, where it's if you believed in Allen Robinson as a number one wide receiver who belonged with your team that you wanted to have around, if he was asking for $18 million and you wanted him at $16 million, $2 million over the course of that contract, like, you can split the difference, you can compromise, and you can find a way to make things work. It's more complicated than just what the average per year value is going to be. Roquan's going to be looking at guaranteed money in particular. He seems to have a pretty good head on his shoulders to know when he's potentially being taken advantage of and not in these negotiations. And I think, or I wonder if Poles and Stein go into this saying it's Roquan Smith, there's no agent. Maybe let's see if we can get us a particularly team-friendly deal. Not to disrespect him. They're still trying to pay him a lot of money, but just trying to squeeze as much as they can back out of it. Evidently, that has backfired. It sounds like there's been some emotion involved in this with Roquan that maybe wouldn't be there had an agent been there, but they also might not have gone about it in the same way had an agent been there, because they know they have the leverage over Roquan. So Roquan can raise this stink and they can say, okay, you know what? Sorry, we do value you. Here's a more Roquan Smith friendly offer. Let's get this done. And maybe in a week or two from now, this is all over. Because at least, like, Roquan has the leverage up until about week 1, right? Like, he doesn't need to be at training camp. He doesn't need to be at the practice, at the preseason games. But, like, if he starts missing regular season games, over the course of, if he misses a full season or whatever, does that start to lower his value to other teams? If he becomes more of a problem directly in this way? I mean, I certainly think from a Bears perspective, getting a first-round pick plus back for him would accelerate some of the things they want to do in terms of turning over this roster. But again, Roquan Smith is going to should be a valued part of that process for the Bears, because you can't just because Roquan Smith doesn't play a position that you might not value as much, doesn't mean you can just find other players of that talent caliber at other positions just to replace him with. Like, we won't pay Roquan because we can find better players there. So it's messy. I don't necessarily see this as like a astronomical blunder by Brian Poles. I mean, between this and the Tevin Jenkins situation, I know there's sort of becoming a track record here, but I do think it's important to distinguish that these are with players from the previous regime, and that a lot of this is part of this team building and turnover process here in this organization. And yes, like, it doesn't look good. I'm not trying to say like, Ryan Poles is doing a great job and this is all good and fine and dandy and he should be lauded for how he's handling the situation. No, I don't think it's not a good look for Poles, and it's not a good look for this new regime. I don't think it's devastating, and I don't think it's a referendum on them just yet. I mean, we'll have to see how things go on the field this season and how their personnel decisions will be the ones that ultimately decide whether or not this is a good regime or not at general manager and head coach, right? Roquan Smith was not their personnel decision. Justin Fields was not their personnel decision. Tevin Jenkins, not their personnel decision. So, like, as long as it involves players from the previous regime, I'm always going to give them a little bit, not exactly a pass, because there's still good and bad ways to handle that, and not all situations are created equal. But I'm gonna watch it a little bit more bigger picture when it involves players from the previous regime. When it becomes a problem with players that they signed, they traded for, they drafted, that they brought in, and they put their mark on and said, these are our guys, and then we start to have issues with those players not performing or not being reliable or whatever it is, that's where I'm going to more specifically judge Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus on how their team building is going. Because for now, they're still dealing with the aftermath of the previous regime. That was a lot of that was largely out of their control, and they're picking up, in the middle of the process, trying to reestablish their control on it, and that's where these tensions are forming with these players. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're doing it wrong or bad, but we need to see exactly how it plays out before we can judge how good of a job they're doing in this situation. Regardless, it's messy. Messy doesn't look good, and they have not handled it ideally. How about that? They have not handled it in the best or ideal manner, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily handling it catastrophically bad or poorly. It's going to depend on how a lot of this stuff keeps playing out. Whatever happens with Roquan Smith, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you want some more Roquan Smith talk for your second listen today, head on over to the Locked On Sports Today podcast. It's our national sports show breaking down all the biggest stories in sports. Roquan Smith was one of those. And I was on the Locked On Sports Today podcast breaking down the situation a little bit more and slightly different angles there as the questions came to me and wasn't just up to me to talk about the situation. So check out Locked On Sports Today for your second listen. Come back tomorrow for your first listen tomorrow, back to Locked On Bears, and your first opportunity to bear down.